Between mysterious secret organizations, questions about the universe, and things humans simply don't understand, there are plenty of mysteries in the world. And when there's something unknown, there are inevitably a number of theories and conspiracies that surround it. Some of these may have a hint of truth to them, while others remain only speculative. Number 10. For a long time, the purpose of a tiny gland in the center of the brain baffled scientists and fascinated mystics and spiritualists. Even today, the precise purpose of the pineal gland remains somewhat elusive and continues to attract the attention of those who are more spiritually minded. The pineal gland lies in the center of the brain, between the two hemispheres. It's roughly the size of a pea and weighs roughly 1/10 of a gram. The gland has been known about since at least the time of the ancient Greeks, who were the first to make note of its cone-shaped appearance that would later give it its name. For a long time, it was assumed that the only function it played in the brain was to support it, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, scholars began to question that purpose. It was philosopher René Descartes who first suggested that this tiny gland was important to the body's spiritual well-being. He took note of the fact that there was only one pineal gland, while other similar structures in the brain came in pairs. This meant it was a place where information from two places came together to be understood by the mind, which he thought was separate from the body. Because of that, he called the pineal gland the principal seat of the soul. As scientific knowledge developed, it was obvious this likely wasn't the correct answer, but the connection to the soul remained for those who were more spiritually minded. In many philosophies, especially in the East, the idea of a third eye is common. It's often visually depicted as being somewhere in the center of the forehead, at roughly the same level as the pineal gland. Many spiritualists have suggested that the symbolic third eye is in some way tied to the pineal gland, and the concept has appeared frequently in fiction. It's described as a way for humans to see other planes of existence, or connect us to higher beings, or simply alter the way we perceive the world around us. It wasn't until the start of the 20th century that the true purpose of the pineal gland began to be understood. It releases two hormones, serotonin and melatonin. Melatonin plays an important role in helping us to sleep and maintain a healthy circadian rhythm. The gland releases more melatonin when it's dark and less during daylight hours. In some animals, such as lizards and snakes, it's connected to a very literal third eye on the top of their heads, which makes it able to directly detect changes in light. As sleep itself isn't something that's completely understood by scientists, the role of the pineal gland remains somewhat mysterious. Number 9. For decades, scientists around the world have been scanning the stars in search of extraterrestrial life. According to the Drake equation, and using our current understanding of how life develops, there should be roughly 20 alien civilizations in our galactic neighborhood. But if these civilizations are there, we haven't found any trace of them. This is the Fermi paradox. There are many explanations that have been put forward for why that is, but the most chilling theory is referred to as the dark forest theory. The name comes from an analogy put forward in 2008's science fiction novel, Dark Forest, but some believe that it may be more fact than fiction. The analogy states that each civilization is like a hunter alone in a dark forest. He's aware that there are other beings in the forest, but he doesn't know their intentions. They may be harmless, but they may be just as or even more dangerous than him. He cannot draw attention to himself, and if he comes across another life form in the forest, he must extinguish it before it gets the chance to do the same to him. According to the theory, the reason why we haven't found any signs of extraterrestrial life is because each civilization is scared of drawing the attention of another. They would have no way of communicating with the other civilization that they didn't intend to hurt anybody, and would expect to be attacked before they could show that they weren't hostile. There are many critics of the dark forest theory, and it's generally not thought to be the most likely solution to the Fermi paradox. One of the big problems with this theory is that it assumes all other civilizations will assume the worst of any unknown entity. If a species has no reason to believe that another would want to hurt them, it's unlikely to think that they would be hostile. Considering the dark forest analogy, the civilization wouldn't necessarily be a hunter, but a harmless traveler moving through the forest, with no reason to believe that anybody else in the forest posed a threat to them. It also assumes that all these other civilizations would act in the same way. Even if some were naturally cautious in the same way as humans, it's unlikely that all would be that way. Even within a species, there would likely be some that would want to reach out to other civilizations, and others that would want to remain isolationists. This would be the case unless there was some really dark entity that had been attacking any technologically advanced society it came across at some point in the galaxy's history, and sending all the other civilizations into hiding. If this was the case, the main question would be where this entity is now. Humans have been broadcasting radio signals for over 100 years. Most are terrestrial in nature, but some are sent out into space, either accidentally or on purpose. In more recent years, these signals have been specifically designed to draw the attention of other civilizations and tell them precisely where they can find us. If other civilizations were inclined to act with hostility to a sudden noise in the dark forest, due to this self-preservation or otherwise, then they would have already attacked Earth. As this hasn't happened yet, we can assume that either the dark forest isn't the answer to the mystery of the Fermi paradox, or our signals haven't yet reached this mysterious and dangerous entity. Number 8. In western Connecticut, near the town of Cornwall in Dudleytown, there's an abandoned settlement that's today off limits to the general public. This hasn't stopped explorers and ghost hunters from taking the trip into the dark entry forest, or conspiracy theorists from speculating about why it's really out of bounds. Dudleytown was first settled in the early 1740s by the Dudley family. It was nestled between 3 hills that cast shadows across the settlement, giving the forest that surrounded it the eerie name. Over the years, the settlement grew, but at its peak, it only had roughly 24 families living there. Forest was cleared to make way for farms, but the soil in the area was not good for agriculture. Settlers slowly abandoned the town in favor of nearby Cornwall, which was much better suited for agriculture. For a while, the town survived on timber and the iron industry, but that also gradually faded away and the town was abandoned. Around the year 1900, Dr. William Clark came across the land and decided to make himself a second home there. He and his family visited regularly up until 1918, when tragedy struck Mrs. Clark. The doctor continued to visit Dudleytown until 1930, and he and his new wife formed the Dark Entry Forest Association to mind the land that Dudleytown sits on. Ever since then, the association has looked after the area, working on reforesting land that's been cleared for farms. The homes are now mostly rubble, with only the cellars still intact. In 1999, the association announced they would no longer allow hikers onto their property, and the entire area of Dudleytown was closed off to the public. Officially, it was to stop vandalism and to protect the natural environment, but some believe there's more to it than that. Since the 1940s, there have been stories that Dudleytown is haunted or even cursed. The curse allegedly goes back to 1510, when Edmund Dudley was involved in a plot to overthrow King Henry VIII. The curse was passed on to his descendants, including those who tried to make lives for themselves abroad. According to legend, that included a family that immigrated to the New World and became the Dudleys that Dudleytown is named after. There are many stories of residents meeting unnatural ends, and others being driven to insanity by some unknown force. Mrs. Clark herself was the last to be driven mad by Dudleytown. The legend states that William had gone away on a work trip for 36 hours and came back to find that she'd been driven insane and was talking about something in the forest coming to get her. She passed away not long after. This wasn't the first time that someone had spoken about something mysterious in the woods. Some have speculated that there was something about the location that hurt people's mental health. The location of the hills meant that the settlement was in shadows for most of the time, and there may have been something in the soil. Even if the town wasn't cursed by supernatural means, it could have been hurt due to natural coincidences. For decades, ghost hunters have visited the area in search of some kind of answer to the mysteries surrounding Dudleytown's past. It was described in one 1993 article as the most haunted place on Earth. Its reputation for the paranormal means that when the Blair Witch Project was released in 1999, people associated the events of the film with Dudleytown, and more visitors than ever came to the site. This then prompted the Dark Entry Forest Association to close off the site, leaving people speculating about what could really be hidden there. Number 7. One of the recurring conspiracy theories is that of a secret, mysterious organization that's controlling the country or even the entire world from behind the scenes. The conspiracy theory dates back to Roman times, and while the specifics of the organization and their motivations have changed over time, it's still the most popular theory today. In modern times, the Freemasons are one of the most famous groups linked to this specific conspiracy theory. Many other theories get tied to the Freemasons, even if there isn't actually much evidence that this organization was involved. Mason lodges date back to the 1600s, when they were simply guilds of stonemasons. When membership began to decrease, people who didn't have any connection to the profession were accepted as honorary members. The different lodges would become something like social groups, where people from different walks of life could come together to share different philosophical ideas, usually at cafes or pubs. While talk of politics and religion was forbidden, it would be difficult to stop people from talking about the events of the day. As the 1700s wore on, revolutionary ideas likely spread throughout the groups. For those who weren't part of the Freemasons, the group became an easy scapegoat. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of considerable change. Centuries-old monarchies were falling, and the old way of doing things was coming to an end across Europe. The Freemasons were already a relatively secret organization. The fact that they facilitated the meetings of groups of people that society wouldn't normally expect to be together helped to convince people that they were doing things they shouldn't be, and could be responsible for events like the French Revolution. Even those who weren't conspiracy-minded believed the Freemasons might have had a hand in such events. The sharing of ideas might have been significant enough to tip the balance and convince people to take action against the old systems. But this likely wasn't part of some grand plan by a shady organization. One event that does stand out in the history of the Freemasons was the disappearance of William Morgan in 1826. William was a drifter living in New York at the time. He'd infiltrated a local Masonic lodge and was planning to publish their secrets with a friend and newspaper publisher, David Miller. Morgan and Miller believed that the Freemasons were representative of an unfair society that made social progression difficult. Miller's newspaper company was barely staying afloat, and Morgan struggled to keep a job. After infiltrating the lodge, Morgan teased his upcoming book, promising to reveal secret rituals that the Masons performed. Unfortunately for him, that attracted a campaign of harassment for both he and Miller. They were arrested multiple times for petty debts. On September 11, 1826, Mason was arrested by police officers believed to have ties to the Masons. Later that evening, he was bailed out by another group of Masons and forced into a carriage that was waiting outside, and he was never seen or heard from again. 4 people later stood trial, but they all received light sentences for forcibly moving Morgan against his will. Morgan's book was later published and spurred a wave of anti-Freemasonry across the US. But the truth about what actually happened to him was never revealed and remains a mystery to this day. Number 6. Ever since Bitcoin was first invented, there's been speculation and theories about the mysterious person behind it. Many different computer experts and even teams of people have been put forward as the person or people behind the name Satoshi Nakamoto. But an interesting conspiracy theory is that the CIA itself had a hand in Bitcoin's creation. In 2008, an internet user calling himself Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper describing Bitcoin's technical specifications and his motivations for creating a decentralized currency. A year later, the most famous cryptocurrency was launched and has continued to grow in popularity ever since. Only a year after Bitcoin was launched, Nakamoto handed over the project to others and faded into the background before completely disappearing without a trace. Since then, people have been speculating about who this most famous unknown person was. Various people from Japan, the US, and the UK have been put forward as the inventors, with a few different candidates having some evidence behind them. The idea that the CIA or another three-letter agency like the NSA is behind Bitcoin isn't a popular theory, and there isn't much evidence behind this conspiracy. But if it turned out to be true, it could be a devastating impact on those who use the currency. Government agencies have had an interest in cryptocurrency long before the invention of Bitcoin. One of the first writings on cryptocurrency was a 1996 paper called How to Make a Mint: The Cryptography of Anonymous Electronic Cash, which was written by the NSA. In 2001, the NSA published the Secure Hash Algorithm 2, or SHA-2, a set of hash functions used to encrypt information. It's the same system that Bitcoin uses. That doesn't necessarily mean that Bitcoin has any connection to the agency. By the time Bitcoin was released, SHA-2 had been public for years, and many different computer systems use the algorithm for everything, from digital signatures to password authentication. For years, computer scientists have been using the system and haven't found any backdoors that the NSA or its allies could use to decode information that passes through the functions. But just because it hasn't been found, that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. The idea that the CIA or NSA might be using Bitcoin for spying purposes gained traction again in 2020, when the Washington Post revealed that the CIA secretly owned a company called Crypto AG. Crypto AG is an encryption company that's existed since World War II. It isn't directly connected to cryptocurrency, but instead sells encryption devices to the governments of over 120 countries. These devices had a backdoor that allowed the CIA to gain messages between foreign governments and their diplomats, military, and spies. It's not known for certain just how much these devices would have been examined by the governments that used them, but we do know that the backdoor remained hidden for a long time. It's possible that a hidden backdoor exists in SHA-2, and with the projects that use the algorithm. This wouldn't necessarily mean that Nakamoto was or is a CIA or NSA agent, but could mean that Bitcoin is still being used as a tool by one of these agencies. Another piece of evidence believers in this conspiracy theory have put forward is the name Satoshi Nakamoto itself. The name is relatively common in Japan, but it could have a double meaning. According to the theory, and according to definitions, Satoshi means wise or intelligent, while Nakamoto means central. The CIA making their pseudonym a reference to their own name doesn't sound very intelligent, but that could be just the logic they used when they came up with it. One of the biggest problems with this conspiracy theory is that it doesn't explain why the CIA or NSA would create Bitcoin. Some have speculated that it was created to mitigate against a potential economic collapse, like that which happened shortly before Bitcoin was launched. Alternatively, there may be some kind of information that the agencies have been able to extract from Bitcoin users, and will continue to do so until the currency stops being useful. Number 5. On November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell from a 13th floor window of a New York hotel. He was still alive when he hit the ground and tried to say something to the person who found him, but his words couldn't be made out. He soon passed away, taking the secret of what really happened to him to his grave. The mystery of Olson's unexplained passing may have been tied up in one of the most famous conspiracies in US history, the infamous MKUltra experiments. But there may have been more to this mystery than first seemed. At the end of the Second World War, the US military and intelligence agencies began to look into other methods that the Soviet Union might use to get an upper hand during the Cold War. Atomic weapons were the most obvious. Even though the exact details of these were closely guarded secrets, it was difficult to hide the ever bigger tests that were taking place. But other experiments could happen more secretly. In the mid-1940s, a rural area of Maryland was taken over by a military facility, initially called Camp Detrick. According to officials, the location was chosen because nearby residents knew not to investigate what was happening on their doorstep. To them, it was a facility that produced the colored smoke for airplanes. It was actually one of the biggest biological laboratories in the world. Frank Olson was one of many scientists who came to work at the facility. He specialized in aerobiology and biological toxins, and quickly became an important figure in the experimental programs there. The full extent of the experiments that happened at Camp Detrick has never been fully revealed. At some point during his time with the US Army, Olson began working with the CIA. He was part of Project Artichoke, which was designed to research interrogation techniques. This would later evolve into the more famous MKUltra. There were two main purposes of these experiments. One of the biggest fears that intelligence agencies had was that their own people could be brainwashed or mind-controlled by Soviet forces. They were worried about what kind of techniques the USSR might have at their disposal, and wanted to make sure they could protect their secrets against these techniques. But there was also a desire to use the techniques themselves to get information from enemy spies or other individuals during the Cold War. As part of his job, Olson traveled around Europe and is believed to have witnessed some of the Project Artichoke experiments firsthand. By the end of 1953, something had changed with Olson. He seemed to have a change of heart, although some sources claim that this only happened after he was dosed with the same substance that MKUltra would later be known for. Some sources claim that he was put off by his work after seeing what was happening in Europe, while his wife believed that it was events happening in Korea that had changed his mind. For whatever reason, his co-workers at the CIA seemed to believe that Olson was a risk and was going to blow the whistle on something. On November 24th, Olson went to see a CIA-approved physician and was convinced to voluntarily submit himself to a sanatorium. Before he could do that, he went to stay at the Statler Hotel in Manhattan, where he shared a room with another coworker. It was 2 a.m. when Olson fell from the 13th story window. At the time, an autopsy didn't take place, and Olson's family were told they couldn't see his body. It was alleged that Olson had fallen after being given a hallucinogenic substance. His passing was a tragic accident, but the result of secret experiments. Years later, it was revealed that there hadn't been any scratches or wounds from glass, and the most serious wound seemed to have been inflicted by the butt of a weapon, rather than a falling. Olson's family still believe today that his passing was deliberate, and part of some cover-up for whatever he was unhappy with at his work. Many of the files related to MKUltra have been destroyed, and it's possible that the truth may never be revealed. It's also possible that what Olson was going to reveal had nothing to do with this specific conspiracy, but something else more disturbing that's waiting to be uncovered. Number 4. Officials described the Plum Island Animal Disease Center as secure but not secret. Information about the research conducted on the island is periodically made public in scientific journals, but the secure nature of the facility and what we already know has taken place there has inspired conspiracy theorists for decades. Plum Island is a small island off the northeast coast of Long Island. Ever since the Spanish-American War, it's been an important military position, protecting the Long Island Sound from potential invaders. However, in the 1950s, the focus shifted to protecting against a different type of defense. Outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in Canada and Mexico meant there was a need to create a research facility to prevent or handle any potential outbreak in the US. Foot and mouth disease is one of the most contagious diseases we currently know about. It cannot affect humans and only affects hooved animals, such as cows and pigs. But outbreaks can be devastating to the farming industry, as entire herds must be wiped out to make sure it doesn't spread. It also results in restrictions on the sale of meat and dairy internationally. An outbreak in the US would cost billions of dollars, but the disease could be so devastating it was important to create a facility offshore so that the proper containment could take place. Plum Island was the perfect host, and since the 1950s, it's been home to the Animal Disease Center. The purpose of research at the facility has widened to include other animal diseases, including African swine fever. But in the 1960s, many experiments had a more nefarious purpose. For decades, officials denied there was any research into using diseases as weapons. But in the 1990s, leaks proved that this wasn't the case. The research had looked into spreading diseases using insects, although these programs were shut down in 1969. Today, the facility remains the only place in the country authorized to work with live samples of foot and mouth disease. It's also home to many different variations on vaccines for the disease, which could be deployed if an outbreak occurred in North America. The main conspiracy theory surrounding the facility concerns Lyme disease. Lyme disease affects hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. It's spread through ticks and can affect the nervous system. It was first recognized in the town of Lyme, Connecticut in 1975. Coincidentally, the town is the closest to Plum Island. The proximity of Lyme to a place known for research into diseases spread by insects led to the conspiracy theories being spread. In recent years, believers in the theory have included representatives in the US government, and a House investigation into the theory took place. According to officials, there's no evidence that Lyme disease had any connection to Plum Island. There's no evidence of a single point of origin for the disease, as it's been found all over the US and not just in close proximity to Lyme or Plum Island. There's also no evidence that Plum Island researchers ever used ticks specifically in their research. The most damning piece of evidence against this theory is the fact that we have samples of Lyme disease from long before the Plum Island facility was even set up. Ticks collected in 1945 and mice from 1894 were both found to have the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, making it impossible for Plum Island to be the origin of the disease. Other conspiracy theories include experiments to make hybrid animals at the facility. In 2008, a deformed creature washed ashore near Montauk, New York. While researchers believed that this creature was a raccoon, others believe the so-called Montauk Monster was an experiment that had escaped Plum Island. The facility is today in the process of being shut down and moved to a more secure facility in Kansas. What happened to Plum Island after this is still being debated. Some want the island to become a nature reserve or a public park. If the conspiracy theories are correct, it may be a long time before anybody would want to spend leisure time on this island. Number 3. In August of 1951, a picturesque town in southern France became overwhelmed by a mysterious disease that seemed to drive people to insanity. Dozens were sent to asylums, and multiple people passed away during the hysteria. Over half a century later, the cause of this mysterious infliction has never been fully determined, but conspiracy theorists believe the CIA may be behind it. Pont-Saint-Esprit is a small town best known for its association to the Bouvier family. Other than that, not much significant has happened in the town, and it's unlikely anybody from outside the area would have heard of it. It definitely didn't seem like the kind of place that would attract the attention of the CIA. On August 15, 1951, hundreds of people from across the town started to suffer from a strange infliction. For most people, the symptoms were limited. People suffered from nausea and stomach pain, cold sweats, and low temperatures. They suffered from insomnia and had given an unpleasant aroma that couldn't be explained. For dozens of people, the disease was even more terrifying. They suffered from awful hallucinations. A postman described the sensation of feeling as if he was shrinking, while fire and snakes twisted around his arm. Many people saw fires that didn't exist, or terrifying beasts that chased them through the street. Others believed they had turned into animals, and a few fell from windows while trying to fly. 50 people were taken to asylums due to these episodes, but restraining them only seemed to make things worse. Most people would eventually recover, though the ordeal remained fresh in their minds even decades later. Sadly, 7 people would pass away during the panic. Investigations into what happened began swiftly. The disease seemed to affect people from all walks of life and wasn't necessarily contagious. It was theorized that ergot poisoning was responsible, as they had all recently bought bread from the best baker in the area. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. If humans or mammals consume rye tainted with the fungus, it can cause hallucinations and other terrifying symptoms. Ergot poisoning has been blamed for multiple cases of mass hysteria, including the events of the Salem witch trials, as well as heightening the events of the Great Fear during the French Revolution. It was theorized that bread made from rye contaminated with ergot had caused the mysterious disease, which earned the event the nickname the cursed bread in French. But others argued that ergot is frequently present in French flour, and that this had never been recorded as happening before. The president of the French Millers Union insisted that there had to be some other cause for the disease. Mercury was put forward as a potential alternative, and it may have been something in the water rather than the flour that had caused the bread to turn toxic. More recently, another theory was put forward. In 2009, a CIA document with the mysterious label was uncovered: Pont-Saint-Esprit and F. Olson files. The label instructed Olson, presumably CIA agent Frank Olson, to hand the documents to a man named Bellin and tell him to bury them. Bellin is believed to refer to David Bellin, who was heading up an investigation into CIA activities internationally. Conspiracy theorists believe this is proof that the CIA was behind the events of August 15, 1951. The organization may have contaminated the bread in some way to observe what would happen. Alternatively, the document could simply be an indication that the CIA was also interested in getting to the bottom of the mystery and hadn't actually had anything to do with causing it. For now, the mystery remains, and the conspiracy theory that the CIA was involved is as valid of an explanation as any other. Number 2. One of the impacts of social media is that conspiracy theories can be quickly shared and examined by a wide audience. This was seen in 2022, soon after the eruption of a volcano in the Pacific Ocean, which triggered conspiracy theories about nuclear weapons. The eruption in question was that of a submarine volcano in the Tonga archipelago. The volcano sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where a series of plate boundaries make the entire area extremely tectonically and volcanically active. The volcano had been erupting periodically since 2009, and in December of 2021, a new series of eruptions began. That reached a peak in the early hours of January 14, 2022, when an enormous eruption began. The ash cloud from the volcano was over 3 miles wide and blocked out the sun on nearby islands. Tsunamis triggered by the eruption hit the coasts of countries around the Pacific and lasted until January 20th. The sound of the eruption was heard as far away as Alaska. In total, it was the largest atmospheric eruption recorded by modern instruments. Videos of the eruption circulated on social media, including the stunning views of the event captured by satellites. It wasn't long before some social media users noticed something unusual. Shortly before the eruption, a relatively small white object appeared on satellite images. According to one TikTok user, it plunged into the sea next to the volcano and seemed to trigger the eruption. Conspiracy theorists believe that the white object was some kind of weapon, possibly nuclear in nature. Either the eruption that followed was simply the detonation of this weapon, or the weapon simply caused the volcanic eruption. Almost as soon as the conspiracy theory started to be shared, people began to debunk it. Data gathered from the eruption showed that there were none of the nuclear elements in the gas clouds that would have been present if this was a nuclear event. The makeup of the gas and ash spread by the volcanic eruption lined up with exactly what scientists would expect from an eruption of this kind of volcano. Another major problem with this theory was the fact that the satellite images used by conspiracy theorists could only pick up objects at least 500 meters across, much longer than any known weapon. If something had been fired at the volcano to make it erupt, it would have been picked up on satellite images. It also didn't happen as quickly as TikTok users suggested, as the video was actually a time-lapse of images taken hours apart. In recent years, there have been headlines about the possibility of nuclear weapons being used to trigger a volcanic eruption, especially at the site of America's supervolcano, Yellowstone. If it was possible to trigger a full-scale eruption from Yellowstone, it would have a devastating effect on the US and much of the rest of the world. But scientists at Yellowstone believe that the force needed to trigger an eruption will be greater than any nuclear weapon that currently exists. The reasoning is that these weapons generally trigger earthquakes that are smaller than those which naturally occur. As Yellowstone has survived some pretty large earthquakes, including ones originating from directly beside the volcano's magma chamber, it's unlikely that a nuclear weapon would be able to trigger an eruption. The same is likely true in this case. It would take a lot more force than a single weapon to trigger such a devastating blast. Number 1. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was one racehorse that dominated proceedings. Phar Lap had an extensive record that made him famous in Australia, where most of his races took place. But today, he's most famous for his mysterious passing, thousands of miles away in California. In 1932, Phar Lap and his team traveled to Mexico to compete in the prestigious Agua Caliente handicap. There was significant security surrounding the horse. All his food had been shipped with him from New Zealand, and all of his water was tested first before the horse was allowed to drink. Security minded the stable where he was kept at all hours, and his caretaker, Tommy Woodcock, vowed to never leave his side while he was in the Americas. The high security seemed to do the trick in Mexico. According to Tommy, he was told that some of the people around were known members of criminal organizations. One in particular he referred to as the Brazilian. They controlled the racing racket and were known to be dangerous. Despite this, the only harm that came to Far Lap during his time in Mexico was an accident in training that left him with a split hoof. Even with the accident, Far Lap won the Agua Caliente handicap in record time. It was to be his final race. After the Mexican race, the team traveled to the San Francisco Bay Area of California, where they hoped Far Lap would be able to compete in some other races. On the morning of April 5, 1932, Tommy visited Far Lap in the stable and found him lying on his side in distress. He was seriously ill, and the horse's vet was brought to the stable. There was nothing they could do to save him, and he passed away that same day. According to official reports, the horse had suffered from colic, which caused inflammation in his internal organs. But there were soon conspiracy theories that someone had deliberately taken the horse's life. There had been 2 attempts on Far Lap's life. In 1930, before the Melbourne Cup, there were 2 separate attempts to harm the horse. Both had been crude and failed. The theory in this case was that the gangsters who'd been in Mexico had lost a lot of money when Far Lap won the Agua Caliente race. The man known as the Brazilian had been hanging around the stable when the horse returned limping following an accident. It's believed that they assumed the horse wouldn't have been able to race and betted against him. When the horse did race, and in fact won, they lost a lot of money. Security in the US hadn't been as tight as in Mexico, and it's possible someone might have been able to slip into the barn where the horse was kept to feed it something it shouldn't have had. Far Lap was taxidermied after he passed, which meant that investigators were able to analyze a hair sample. They found evidence of arsenic in the hair, and were able to confirm that this hadn't been part of the taxidermy process. This wasn't proof of the crime, though. It was possible that the substance had been present in medication used to soothe Far Lap's pain before he passed. Modern researchers believe the horse may have suffered from a bacterial disease that wasn't identified until the 1980s, long after Far Lap had passed away. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.